You don't need to know someone's life to feel behind them. It happens in a fraction of a second. Someone mentions a salary. Someone posts a photo. Someone gets a promotion announcement on LinkedIn, or shows up to a reunion looking a certain way, or casually references something they've done that you haven't. And before any conscious thought has formed, before you've decided to evaluate, before you've chosen to care, something has already shifted inside you. A small recalibration, a quiet repositioning of where you stand. You didn't ask for it. You may not even fully notice it, but it happened, and it will happen again, probably before the day is over, probably more times than you'll be able to count if you're being honest with yourself. This is social comparison, and it is one of the most constant, most automatic, most consequential processes running in the background of a human life. We talk about it almost exclusively in the language of pathology, the comparison trap, the comparison game, the toxic habit of measuring yourself against others. The advice is consistent. Stop comparing yourself. Focus on your own path. Run your own race. It is also, as advice, almost entirely useless. Not because the intention behind it is wrong, but because it misidentifies the nature of the thing it's trying to address. Social comparison is not a bad habit you developed. It is not a cognitive distortion to be corrected. It is a fundamental feature of human psychology, ancient, biological, and woven so deeply into the architecture of how we perceive ourselves and others that telling someone to stop doing it is a little like telling them to stop having a nervous system. The more interesting question is not how to stop, it's why it's there at all, what it's doing, what it actually costs, and what changes when you understand it clearly rather than just feeling bad about it.
Begin with the origin, because social comparison did not emerge from Instagram or LinkedIn or the particular anxieties of modern life. It is far older than any of those things. In 1954, the social psychologist Leon Festinger published what became one of the most cited papers in the history of social psychology. He called it a theory of social comparison processes, and its core proposition was straightforward. Human beings have a fundamental drive to evaluate their own opinions and abilities. And when objective, non-social standards for that evaluation are unavailable, which is most of the time, they evaluate themselves by comparing to other people. Festinger's insight was that social comparison isn't a failure of self-sufficiency, it's a rational response to a genuine epistemic problem. How good are you at your job? How reasonable is your opinion on a contested question? How healthy is your body? How adequate is your salary? How stable is your relationship? These are not questions with objective, context-free answers. They require a reference point. And the most available reference point is always other people. But the evolutionary roots go deeper than Festinger's information processing framing. Social comparison is, at its core, a status monitoring system. And status monitoring was not a vanity project for our evolutionary ancestors. It was survival infrastructure. In the small, stable social groups in which humans evolved, groups of roughly 50 to 150 individuals, your position in the social hierarchy had direct consequences for your access to resources, to mates, to protection, to the kind of social support that determined whether you survived a bad season or a serious illness. Knowing where you stood relative to others was not psychologically optional. It was information that the organism needed to navigate the social environment competently. The brain systems that produce social comparison, the continuous, largely automatic monitoring of other people's status, capabilities, and resources relative to your own, were adaptive because they were accurate. They kept you calibrated to your actual social position in a way that informed consequential decisions. What changed is not the system. The system is the same. What changed is the environment in which it operates. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, in his Hierarchy of Needs, placed esteem, both self-esteem and the esteem of others, as one of the fundamental human motivations, sitting above physiological survival and safety, but below self-actualization. His framework has been critiqued and revised in various ways since the 1940s, but the basic observation it encodes has proven durable. The need to feel valued, capable, and respected relative to others is not a luxury. It is a genuine psychological need, as real in its functional importance as the need for food or shelter, even if less immediately physical in its expression. This matters because it reframes what social comparison is actually doing when it runs. It is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working as designed, monitoring a variable that the organism treats as important to its functioning. The discomfort that comes with unfavorable comparisons is not a malfunction. It is the signal the system sends when it detects a potential threat to social position. What varies enormously across people and contexts is what triggers the system, what comparison dimensions it fixates on, and how the information it generates gets processed. And this variation is where the psychology becomes genuinely interesting.
Vestiger identified a specific preference in social comparison that has been replicated consistently across decades of research. People prefer to compare themselves to others who are similar to them on relevant dimensions. You don't typically experience your self-worth as a writer being threatened by Cormac McCarthy. The gap is too large to register as a meaningful comparison. It produces admiration or awe or aspiration, but not the particular sting of comparison. What produces the sting is the person who is close to you in age, background, experience, and context. The peer, the former classmate, the colleague at a similar level, who seems to be doing slightly better than you are. This is what Vestiger called lateral comparison, and it is by far the most emotionally charged form. Not looking up at the summit, but looking sideways at someone on the same slope who appears to be moving faster. The evolutionary logic of this preference is fairly clear. Comparing yourself to someone dramatically above you in status provides limited calibration information. You already know the gap is large. Comparing yourself to someone dramatically below you is similarly uninformative. The useful information for navigating a social hierarchy comes from monitoring the people closest to you, the ones whose position is genuinely competitive with yours, where small differences in relative standing actually matter. But in the modern environment, the lateral comparison system encounters a reference group it was never designed for. The people who feel like peers, similar in age, background, and aspiration, now number not in the dozens of a small social group, but in the thousands or tens of thousands, distributed across a social media landscape that selectively surfaces their most visible achievements. The system tries to do what it evolved to do, but the reference group has become so large and so filtered that the calibration it produces is systematically distorted. There is a distinction in the social comparison literature between upward comparison and downward comparison that is worth sitting with, because the psychological effects of each are more complicated than they initially appear. Upward comparison, measuring yourself against someone doing better, is the form most associated with negative emotion, the envy, the inadequacy, the deflation of self-assessment. And this is real. The research confirms it. But upward comparison also, under certain conditions, produces motivation, inspiration, and the kind of aspirational energy that drives genuine improvement. The same comparison that makes you feel inadequate can also make the goal feel more real and attainable, because here is someone who achieved it. Here is proof that it can be done. What determines which response dominates is partly the psychological distance between you and the comparison target, and partly something more personal, the degree to which you experience the comparison as informational versus as a verdict on your worth. Downward comparison, measuring yourself against someone doing worse, produces the opposite pattern. It reliably increases momentary positive affect. You feel better, briefly, about your own position, but the research on its longer-term effects is less flattering. Chronic downward comparison is associated with decreased motivation, with a defensive orientation toward effort and risk, and with the social dynamic, deriving your sense of adequacy from others' inadequacy, that tends to corrode relationships and narrow the self. What both forms share is that they are primarily about regulation of self-esteem rather than accurate self-assessment. They are emotional management strategies that happen to use other people as reference points. And like most emotional management strategies, their short-term effects and their long-term effects are often in tension.
Now introduce the specific distortion that contemporary media environments have introduced into this ancient system, and it is a distortion of a kind and scale that has no historical precedent. The social comparison system evolved in an environment of roughly radical transparency. In a small group of 150 people, you had continuous, unfiltered, multidimensional information about everyone. You saw their failures as readily as their successes. You saw them sick and tired and afraid and wrong. The comparison was against the full person in the full complexity of their life, not against a curated version. Social media is structurally the opposite of this. It is a system designed, not incidentally, but essentially, to surface the curated, edited, highlight reel version of other people's lives. The achievements, the milestones, the aesthetically composed moments. Not from malice, because that content generates more engagement than ordinary content, because the algorithm rewards it, because every individual actor in the system making their own rational choices about what to post creates an aggregate environment of selective positivity. Your social comparison system receives this curated data and treats it as what it evolved to treat similar data as, an accurate representation of how other people are actually doing. The system doesn't know it's being fed a highlight reel. It processes the information it receives, and the information it receives, continuous, high volume, skewed toward achievement and away from struggle, tells it that the people around you are doing substantially better than you are. The benchmark produced by this environment doesn't correspond to any real distribution of human experience, but it shapes self-assessment with the same force as if it did. And the person on the receiving end, experiencing the automatic, involuntary recalibration that happens when they encounter someone else's visible success, has no phenomenological way to distinguish between a comparison that is informative and one that is the product of a fundamentally distorted reference class. There is a particular emotional experience at the intersection of social comparison and ambition that has a name in German, Schadenfreude, but whose inverse, which may be more psychologically significant, barely has one in any language. The Portuguese word saudade, a longing for something you may never have had, comes close to one dimension of it. But the specific experience I'm pointing toward is what the psychologist Richard Smith has called envy in its most precise sense. The painful awareness that someone else has something you want, combined with the implicit judgment that their having it diminishes you or reflects something about your comparative inadequacy. Envy is one of the most universally experienced and least openly discussed human emotions. It is more socially stigmatized than most negative emotions, more than sadness, more than anger, more even than fear, because it implies a comparison judgment that people are not comfortable acknowledging. To admit envy is to admit that you are measuring yourself against someone, that you found yourself wanting, and that their good fortune is experienced as a form of threat to you.
The stigma produces a specific cognitive pattern. Envy gets mislabeled. The person experiencing it describes it as frustration, as dissatisfaction with their own situation, as a motivation problem, as vague unhappiness, rarely as what it actually is. And unlabeled, it becomes harder to examine and harder to understand what it's actually signaling. Because envy, examined honestly, is not primarily about the other person. It is information about your own desires, about what you want, what you value, what you believe you deserve or are capable of, that is being surfaced by the comparison. The envy you feel toward the person with the career you don't have tells you something about what you want for your career that your ordinary self-reflection might not surface as clearly. In this sense, the emotional pain of social comparison is not purely a problem to be solved. It is at least sometimes a message worth decoding. There is a final layer to this that the behavioral literature addresses less frequently than it should: the relationship between social comparison and identity. We compare ourselves to others not just to assess our abilities or resources, but to locate ourselves in social space, to answer, continuously and often unconsciously, the question of what category of person we are. And this function of social comparison is entangled with something more fragile than competence assessment. It is entangled with self-concept. When the comparison is on a dimension that is central to your identity, your professional competence if you think of yourself as someone defined by your work, your appearance if you've organized significant self-worth around how you look, your intelligence, your creativity, your parenting, your success. The emotional response is not just about the specific dimension. It is about the self-concept that dimension supports. An unfavorable comparison on a dimension that doesn't touch your identity barely registers. An unfavorable comparison on the dimension around which your identity is organized is experienced as a threat to the coherent self. Not just, I'm doing worse than this person, but I may be less than I think I am, which activates defenses, distortions, and self-protective cognitive maneuvers that have nothing to do with the accuracy of the comparison. This is why the advice to simply stop comparing yourself is psychologically uninstructive. The comparison that hurts most is rarely casual. It's the comparison that found the load-bearing wall of your self-concept and applied pressure to it. And the response to that is not a matter of deciding to care less. It is a matter of understanding what the self-concept is built on and whether it can bear the weight being placed on it.
Here's what I find most worth sitting with when all of this is laid out. The problem with social comparison is not that it exists. It is that it operates almost entirely without our awareness, in an information environment that systematically distorts the data it runs on, producing self-assessments that feel accurate and are often not. The person scrolling LinkedIn at 11 p.m., feeling a spreading sense of inadequacy after 3 professional announcements by former classmates, is not experiencing a failure of willpower or self-discipline. They're experiencing a biologically ancient status monitoring system doing exactly what it was designed to do in an environment specifically engineered to produce the maximum activation of that system for commercial purposes. That context doesn't make the feeling less real, but it changes its meaning. The inadequacy signal is not evidence about your actual position in an accurate social landscape. It is evidence about the state of a system that is being systematically misinformed. There's a phenomenon in evolutionary psychology called mismatched environments. The broad class of cases where systems evolved for one environment are operating in a radically different one, producing outputs that made sense in the original context, but are maladaptive in the current one. The craving for sugar and fat made sense in an environment where those calories were scarce and valuable. In an environment where they are cheap and abundant, the same craving produces outcomes that are actively harmful to the organism. Social comparison in a small, transparent, stable community made sense as a calibration and navigation tool. In a global, curated, algorithmically filtered information environment, the same system produces a continuous stream of distorted self-assessments against a benchmark that doesn't exist. The system isn't broken. The environment changed. And recognizing this, clearly, without self-judgment, as a structural fact rather than a personal failing, is the beginning of a different relationship with the comparisons that will, regardless of what you decide about them, continue to run. What would it actually mean to have a less distorted relationship with social comparison? Not to eliminate it, that's not available, but to hold it differently. Part of it is accuracy. Recognizing that the reference group produced by social media is not representative of how people are actually doing.
that the professional announcement doesn't contain the 18 months of uncertainty that preceded it, that the photo doesn't contain the relationship difficulty or the financial stress or the private doubt that coexisted with the moment it captures. Not as a cynical debunking, not as everyone is secretly miserable, but as an accurate corrective to a signal that systematically omits the full picture.
Part of it is dimension selection. The recognition that you are not obligated to compare yourself on the dimensions that the ambient culture prioritizes. Career status, salary, body, lifestyle. These are salient comparison dimensions because they are visible and measurable and heavily signaled in the information environment. But they are not the only dimensions on which a life can be evaluated. And for many people, they are not even the dimensions that most accurately reflect what they value. The person who decides, consciously, to orient their comparison primarily around growth over time. Am I better at this than I was? Am I more honest than I was? Am I more capable of the things I actually care about than I was? Rather than position relative to peers, is not in denial. They are making a deliberate choice about which data the comparison system is fed. And that choice, made consistently, shapes what the system produces. The deeper observation, the one that I think gets closest to what social comparison is actually about, is this. The pain of comparison is almost never really about the other person. It is about the gap between who you are and who you believe you should be. And the other person is simply the surface on which that gap becomes visible. The comparison target is a mirror, not a measure. What you're actually looking at, when you look at someone else's achievement and feel the familiar ache, is a reflection of your own desire, your own sense of what is possible, your own belief about what you are or aren't capable of. That's not a comfortable thing to look at directly. It's easier to look at the other person, to assess them, to contextualize them, to find the ways their situation is different from yours, to feel briefly superior or permanently inadequate or somewhere in the complicated middle. All of that is looking at the mirror rather than at what the mirror is showing. What the mirror is showing is you, your aspirations, your fears about adequacy, your relationship with your own potential. These are not comfortable subjects, but they are the actual subjects. The comparison is the invitation. Whether you follow it inward or stay on the surface of it, that's the choice that actually matters. You will compare yourself to other people today, probably multiple times, probably without deciding to. And that's not a problem. That's Tuesday. What might be different, what the understanding of this whole system makes possible, not through discipline but through clarity, is the moment between the comparison and the response. The fraction of a second in which you might notice what happened, recognize it for what it is, and choose what to do with the information it generated. Not suppress it, not argue yourself out of it, not feel guilty about feeling it, just see it clearly. This is the system running. This is what it's responding to. This is what it might be telling me about myself, if I'm willing to listen. That's a different relationship with one of the most constant processes in your psychological life. Not freedom from comparison, but something more honest than being unconsciously run by it. Thank you for staying with Void Wonder until the end of this episode. In a world where everything is competing for your attention, the fact that you chose to sit down and actually listen to me, that means more than you might think. If this episode left something in your mind, even just a small question, a different angle, then it's done its job. See you in the next episode of Void Wonder.